If you want to understand why so few people ever get rich, you have to begin with an unpleasant truth. Most of the rules society teaches you were not built to make you wealthy. They were built to make you useful. That is not the same thing. Useful people keep systems running. Useful people arrive on time. Useful people follow instructions. Useful people ask how to perform the task, not whether the task itself is the right game to be playing. But useful people are not automatically wealthy people. That is the first distinction I want you to understand, because almost every conversation about success gets confused right there at the start. People are told to get good grades, stay out of trouble, find a stable job, work hard, obey authority, avoid risk, pay what they are told to pay, retire when the script says retire, and be grateful that they were given a place inside the machine. Then, after following those rules for 20 or 30 years, they look up and realize something feels wrong. They are respectable. They are employable. They may even be admired, but they are not free. That is the contradiction. And once you see it clearly, you stop asking the childish question, why am I not rich, even though I did everything right? You begin asking the much better question, right for whom? That is where the real conversation starts. I have spent enough years studying markets, businesses, and human behavior to tell you something most people do not want to hear until late in life. The world runs on two rule books. One for people who will work inside existing structures, and another for people who will own, shape, or exploit those structures. The second is learned privately. The first rule book is about obedience, reliability, and conformity. The second is about leverage, negotiation, ownership, and asymmetry. That is why so many people feel as though the game is rigged. It often is, not because there is one giant meeting where a few men in a room decide to cheat everybody else, because the visible rules and the real wealth rules are not the same rules. If you follow worker rules very well, you may become a very successful worker. You may become comfortable. You may become respected. You may even become upper middle class. But very often you do not become rich. And people find that confusing because they were never taught to distinguish earning from ownership. They were taught to worship effort without first asking who captures the upside created by that effort. That is the central trick. Now, I want to be careful. I am not going to tell you to break the law. That is the language of fools. The law can destroy you if you challenge it stupidly, and many people who confuse recklessness with courage end up learning that lesson the expensive way. What I am talking about is something much more common, much more respectable on the surface, and much more powerful in practice. Breaking social rules, breaking career rules, breaking educational expectations, breaking the mental rules that keep smart people obedient long after obedience has stopped serving them. That is the first rule society teaches is this: get a stable job. I understand why this rule exists. If you are running a civilization, you need people who show up every morning, perform a function, and keep the machinery humming. You need engineers, nurses, salespeople, accountants, managers, administrators, drivers, analysts, lawyers, and clerks. You need people who will plug themselves into a structure and keep it alive. There is nothing dishonorable about that. In fact, much of civilized life depends on it. But let us tell the truth. A stable job was never designed as a reliable path to significant wealth. A stable job was designed as a path to stable labor. That is different. A wage can make you solvent. A wage can make you respectable. A wage can give you comfort. A wage can even give you a very nice life compared with the world average. But a wage usually caps your upside because it places you on the wrong side of leverage. You are selling time. Someone else is capturing scale. That is the hidden divide. If you work for a salary, there is almost always a ceiling on what your effort can produce for you. Personally, even when the effort you contribute produces far more value for the person or institution above you. That is why the stable job rule matters so much. It teaches people to prize predictability over leverage. It teaches them to think in monthly security rather than ownership. And the cruel thing is that the world in which that advice once looked most reasonable barely exists anymore. The old story was simple. Work for one company, be loyal, climb slowly, retire with dignity, maybe collect a pension, maybe keep your health care, maybe live quietly off a system that rewarded patience. That world is largely gone. Companies restructure. Industries disappear. Offices empty. Functions get automated. Management teams cut headcount to save quarterly margins. The worker who thought he bought security often discovers he rented it. That is why I always tell people to distinguish between income and control. A job can give you income. It rarely gives you control and wealth. At the end of the day is a control problem. Who controls the asset? Who controls the upside? Who controls the terms? Who controls the risk? Who controls the decision? The person with the job usually controls the least and absorbs more fragility than he realizes. That is why I say the stable job rule is not a wealth rule. It is a system rule. Now let us go to the second rule. Avoid. This is one of those rules that sounds wise because at one level it is wise. Consumer debt can absolutely destroy people. Credit card debt can hollow out a family. Payday loans are poison. Bad auto debt can turn transportation into bondage. Borrowing for consumption is one of the fastest ways to spend future freedom before it arrives. So in that narrow sense, yes, fear foolish debt. But the poor and middle class are often taught a simpler version. All debt is dangerous. Stay away from leverage. Live only within the boundary of what you can pay for in cash. That sounds prudent. It also cuts off one of the great tools through which wealth is built, because the wealthy do not avoid debt categorically. They distinguish between destructive debt and productive debt. That is a very different mindset. If you borrow to consume, the debt makes you poorer. If you borrow to acquire an asset that throws off cash flow or appreciates faster than the cost of borrowing over time, the debt can make you richer. That does not mean every leveraged purchase is smart. Far from it, it means debt itself is not the deciding factor. The use of debt is. This is why I have always thought the public conversation about debt was half morality play and half misunderstanding. A man who finances a car he cannot really afford, so he can impress strangers, is digging a hole. A man who borrows against a sensibly purchased income, producing asset is using a tool. Same mechanism, different economics. The wealthy understand that difference early. The public is often taught not to. That is part of why wealth compounds at the top and debt compounds at the bottom. The top uses debt to buy assets. The bottom often uses debt to preserve lifestyle. That distinction decides futures. And it is not only real estate. Debt can fund a business. Debt can fund inventory. Debt can fund productive equipment. Debt can fund expansion. Debt can fund an acquisition. Debt can fund a machine that prints more than it costs. That is how the rich think. They ask, what does this debt buy me? Not only, how much does this debt scare me? Fear is not analysis. Structure is analysis. Now let us move to the third rule. Work hard and you will succeed. This one is the most morally seductive and therefore the most dangerous. Because unlike the stable job rule or the no debt rule, this one feels noble. It flatters character. It gives people dignity. It tells them the world is at least somewhat fair. You put in the effort, the reward comes. I wish the world were that clean. It is not hard work matters. Anyone who tells you hard work does not matter is a fool or a parasite. But hard work is not the same as wealth creation. The hardest working people I have ever known were not always rich. Some of the hardest working people in this country are among the poorest. They wake earlier, endure more, recover less, and live closer to the edge than many office professionals who imagine themselves superior because their work looks cleaner. Hard work is real. Wealth is not a reward for hard work alone. Wealth is a reward for hard work combined with leverage, ownership, positioning, and timing. That is the real formula. If you work 60 hours a week for someone else and own none of the upside, you may be admirable, useful, and exhausted. But you are not necessarily getting rich. If you own the asset that hundreds of hard-working people make more valuable every day, your wealth behaves differently from theirs. That is not because you are morally superior. It is because ownership changes the economics. This is the lesson society does not like teaching too clearly, because societies need workers to believe virtue and reward are more tightly linked than they often are. If everyone fully understood how much ownership matters relative to labor, many would stop worshiping jobs and start asking harder questions about capital. That is not a conversation established systems enjoy, and yet it is the truth. A man can work hard his whole life and remain vulnerable because he spent the whole life selling labor inside someone else's machine. Another man can work very hard for a shorter period, build or buy ownership, and then spend decades benefiting from labor that is no longer limited to his own hours. Yes, but do not worship hard work as if it were a complete theory of wealth. It is not. Without ownership, hard work often just makes somebody else richer faster. Now let us talk about taxes, because here the rule book splits almost comically. The ordinary worker is told something like this: pay what you owe, do not play games, the IRS is not your friend, do not get cute. There is wisdom in that for the average wage earner, because the average wage earner has little room to maneuver and very little protection if he behaves carelessly. But wealthy people do not experience taxation the same way. They experience it as a strategic field. They hire accountants, they hire lawyers, they study depreciation, deductions, timing, entity structures, carry rules, losses, capital treatment, real estate treatment, trust structures, and every legal route available to reduce the drag on capital. That is not tax evasion, that is rule exploitation. And it is perfectly respectable in elite circles. The same society that will shame a worker for a small reporting mistake will applaud a billionaire for having a great tax team. That should tell you something. It tells you the real difference is not morality, it is access. The wealthy do not pay taxes like employees because they are not living financially like employees. They are operating through structures, and structures change outcomes. I have always found it amusing that ordinary people are taught to think of the tax code as a kind of moral scoreboard, while sophisticated people understand it is really an incentive manual. The tax code tells you what the state wants to encourage: build housing, get depreciation, invest through certain structures, get different treatment, own real assets, get different treatment, take income through labor, get taxed one way, take it through capital, get treated another. The game is hiding in plain sight. The rule follower treats taxation as a moral burden. The strategic mind studies it as part of the map. That is a major difference between staying comfortable and becoming rich. Now I want to say something harder. A great deal of wealth is not created by simply working inside the lines of social approval. It is created by being willing to make people uncomfortable. I do not mean cruelty for its own sake. I do not mean lawlessness. I do not mean celebrating greed. I mean the willingness to do things that polite society first calls arrogant, strange, risky, or inappropriate, right before it later calls them visionary once they work. This happens over and over. The person who leaves a respectable track to start something is irresponsible until he succeeds. The person who refuses the conventional path is immature until the unconventional path pays. The person who asks directly for money, equity, introductions, or terms is aggressive until the results make everyone reinterpret his behavior as confidence. The person who markets himself loudly is obnoxious until people discover he was right to do so. Success rewrites personality in the eyes of the public. That is another truth nobody says often enough. If you want to get rich, you must be prepared to be misunderstood on the way. That is the cost of deviating from scripts written for order rather than wealth. Most people never make that psychological leap. They need social approval too badly. They need to feel safe inside shared expectations. They would rather be called sensible than powerful. That is fine. But let us not confuse it with a wealth strategy. Now, let us turn to mindset, because this is where all of the above stops being only social critique and becomes operational. If you want wealth, you need to stop thinking like a permission seeker and start thinking like a strategist. That means several shifts. The first shift is from obedience to analysis. Do not ask first, what am I supposed to do? Ask first, who benefits if I do what I am supposed to do? That question alone will save you years. If a rule trains you to become more dependable, more predictable, more indebted, and more attached to one institutional path, You should at least ask whether the rule serves your future or someone else's convenience. Sometimes it will serve both. Many times it will not. The second shift is from risk avoidance to risk management. People who stay poor often do not understand risk at all. They think they are avoiding it. They are not. They are simply accepting familiar risk instead of visible risk. A job feels safe because it is common. But the job may depend on one boss, one industry, one set of corporate decisions, one economic cycle. That is risk. A business feels risky because it is unconventional. But depending on the business, it may offer ownership, leverage, tax advantages, and upside that, a job never will. That too is risk. The point is not to become reckless. The point is to stop pretending that convention equals safety. Convention often just hides risk inside social normality. Once you see that, the question changes, not how do I avoid risk, but which risks are worth taking because the upside changes my life, and which risks only keep me politely trapped. That is how the wealthy think. The third shift is from scarcity to possibility. I do not like the phrase abundance mindset when it is used sloppily, because it often turns into magical thinking, but there is a real idea underneath it. Poor and trapped people are taught to see the world as closed. Few opportunities, few openings, few ways out. Often that is not irrational. Many really are living inside harsh structures. But if you want to rise at some point, you must train yourself to look for openings rather than only walls. Who can I partner with? What skill is underpriced? What market is underserved? What asset is misused? What structure am I obeying that I could instead own? What assumption does everybody around me accept that might actually be false? That is how wealth thinkers operate. They look for asymmetry, not comfort. The fourth shift is from asking permission to creating facts. Again, I do not mean breaking laws. I mean understanding that many of the people who get rich do not wait until every authority figure agrees their idea is respectable. If you wait for universal approval, you are already late. By the time institutions bless a path, the easiest gains are often gone. Rich people understand that permission is often a lagging signal. They build, they sell, they launch, they acquire, they promote, they negotiate. Then, once there is enough momentum, the world begins treating the act as legitimate, because success itself confers legitimacy. This is one of the most irritating truths in all of capitalism. People often decide what was permissible only after they see who won. That is why so many fortunes look obvious in retrospect and insane in real time. Now, there is a boundary here, and it matters. Some people hear ideas like this and think they are being invited to become unethical. That is the easiest lazy response. Ethics matter, reputation matters, trust matters, the ability to sleep matters. If you become rich by poisoning everything you touch, you may have money, but you do not have anything I would call a successful life. I do not admire that. What I am saying is subtler and more practical. The path to wealth usually requires breaking norms, not necessarily breaking morality. It requires being willing to be unconventional before unconventionality becomes fashionable. It requires making moves that the average rule follower will postpone forever because they sound too uncertain, too proud, too strange, or too exposed. That is different from becoming a criminal, and it is important to know the difference. You can reject the conventional career path without becoming dishonest. You can use legal debt intelligently without becoming reckless. You can minimize taxes lawfully without becoming a fraud. You can market yourself assertively without becoming a fraud. You can challenge authority without becoming a fool. These are grown-up distinctions. The world gets confused because it likes simple moral categories. Rich people are either heroes or villains. Workers are either virtuous or weak. No reality is more structural than that. Let me say one more thing about rich children, because this part helps explain the whole system. Rich children are often taught, directly or indirectly, that rules are negotiable. Not because their parents sit them down and say, "Here is how you bend the world," because they watch how the world treats their parents. Their parents ask questions, challenge terms, negotiate prices, question teachers, call administrators, push back on authority, use lawyers, use networks. The child absorbs the lesson. Authority is not final. Authority is a counterparty. That is one of the most valuable lessons a future wealthy person can learn. The poor child often learns the opposite. Authority is dangerous. Authority punishes. Authority is not for bargaining with. Authority is for surviving. That difference compounds for decades. One child grows up learning to negotiate the rules. The other learns to endure them. Then later society calls the first child confident and the second child timid or rigid, as though the difference emerged out of the air. It did not. It was trained. This is why so much success advice is useless. It addresses the behavior without addressing the conditioning. It tells the obedient person to become bold without first teaching him how to reinterpret rules, risk, and authority. That almost never works. You cannot build a wealthy mind on top of a worker script without first rewriting the script. That is the real inner work. Interpretation. Now let us bring all of this to the sentence people least want to hear. Becoming rich usually requires breaking their rules, because their rules were never built to produce your wealth. They were built to preserve their system. That is why the conventional path is so heavily moralized. School, job, obedience, patience, consumption in the approved channels. Retirement at the approved age, all of it keeps the machine predictable. Wealth, on the other hand, often comes from doing something less predictable, owning instead of merely earning, negotiating instead of merely accepting, building instead of merely applying, positioning instead of merely hoping, using law strategically instead of only morally, taking asymmetrical risks instead of avoiding all visible risk, seeing social rules as human inventions rather than sacred walls. That is the difference. And yes, this requires discomfort. It requires criticism. It requires living for a while without the warm blanket of approval that conventional people wrap around themselves and call wisdom. That is why most people never do it. Not because they lack intelligence, because they hate the feeling of stepping outside the rule book that gave them identity. It is very hard to leave a path that made you feel respectable, even after you realize it will never make you rich. I understand that. But I also understand something else. Time is cruel to obedient people who stay too long in the wrong script. Years pass, skills compound, opportunity costs pile up. Then one day the person wakes up and realizes he did not fail because he was lazy. He failed because he kept honoring rules that were never written for the outcome he secretly wanted. That is the tragedy, and it is avoidable. Not easy, avoidable. So if you ask me what it really takes, my answer is simple. You must learn to distinguish system rules from wealth rules. You must know which rules protect you and which rules domesticate you. You must be willing to endure social friction in exchange for strategic freedom. You must stop mistaking convention for safety. You must stop worshiping hard work when the real missing ingredient is ownership. You must stop fearing all debt and start understanding useful leverage. You must stop treating taxes as a moral weather system and start treating structure as part of the game. You must stop asking for universal permission before doing what your life already knows needs to be done. That is not a motivational speech. That is a rewiring. And once the rewiring happens, the whole world starts looking different. You see opportunities where other people see impropriety. You see assets where other people see paperwork. You see leverage where other people see fear. You see rule books where other people see destiny. That is the beginning of wealth. Not the money, the sight, the ability to read the real structure under the polite structure. And when you can do that, the question of becoming rich becomes much less mysterious. It is not about becoming a different species. It is about refusing to keep living by a set of instructions that were never meant to take you where you now want to go. That is why becoming rich requires breaking their rules. Not all rules, the wrong ones. And the longer you wait to figure out which is which, the more expensive obedience becomes.